Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today on this episode, we're going to be talking about the beloved Texas rig. It's the gold standard for bass fishing when it comes to rigging soft plastic and Elastec baits, weedless. You can pretty much use the Texas rig with any soft plastic or Elastec bait. And today we're going to be talking about some customizations that you can do to your Texas rig to increase, the amount of fish that you get to bite that bait, your landing percentage, and just your overall efficiency. So we're going to be getting into those customizations pretty quick here. First off, I do want to mention that as you guys know, or many of you know, I do a lot of content based on your questions or topics that you want me to cover in a video. So if you guys have any questions at all, or you want me to cover a topic, as long as it's a topic or a question that I feel like I can chime in on, I'm definitely going to do a video for you. So make sure you drop a comment below in the comment section in any of these videos. All right, so let's get started. Let's look at the Texas rig right here. This is good old Texas rig, man. This is like one of the first things that you learn how to do in bass fishing is fishing a worm on a Texas rig. So this is pretty standard here. I'll just show you real quick how to rig a Texas rig if you haven't done it before. Essentially, you take a worm hook. This right here is a offset shank round bend worm hook. This is actually the Hayabusa WRM 114. Really good hook. And we're gonna go in right in the center of the nose of the bait, whatever type of bait you're using. We're gonna come out about an 1/8 inch, maybe a 1/4 inch actually, down the chin of the bait. Bring the hook down, bring the eye into the bait, and then we're gonna turn it around like that, and then kind of bring it through the back. Now, if you're using traditional plastics, this is Elastec right here. This is a material that I absolutely love for pretty much all of my soft baits. But if you have traditional plastics, you would then do a little Texpose so you can see, the bend of the hook or the top portion of the hook is kind of exposed there, but you dig your hook point into the plastic, okay? So that's good for traditional plastic because they're more dense, and if you don't do this, if you don't Texpose, you might have an issue getting that hook point through the plastic and getting a good hook set. But with Elastec, and this is a question I get a lot, I'm going to do a separate video based on this. With Elastec, it's so soft and compressible, I actually like to just dig it into the bait like that. Okay, make sure it's straight. That's one of the most important things with the Texas rig. But I dig it right into the center of the bait, and I really don't have any hard time getting a good hook set or anything like that. So anyways, let's just go through the tackle real quick. All the tackle that I'm talking about today will be in the description below. I've got some affiliate links down there. You can get 10% off of your order with 44tackle.com. All right, so real quick, tackle that I'm talking about today, using as an example, this is actually kind of the rig that I use for the majority of my worm fishing with the Texas rig. Now again, you can use the Texas rig with creature baits, tubes, swim baits, worms, whatever type of soft bait that you're throwing, you can rig it with a Texas rig. So depending on what you're doing, like my punching setup is going to be way different than this right here, my worming setup. So, but this is what we're talking about right now is my worming setup. So we've got the Z-Man Mag Fatties. This is a really good bait that I use a lot. And I've got that rigged on an offset shank hook. Now the hooks that I use kind of vary a little bit. There's a few that I really like. The first one is the WRM 114. That's a really good wide bend or a round bend offset shank hook. Really good one overall. And then one that I actually think I use probably more than the round bend is the WRM 957. It doesn't quite have a round bend to it. It's a little bit different, more of a J style, but I really like this one. And it has kind of a wire diameter that I think just works better for, when I'm just fishing a straight tail worm or even a ribbon tail worm. And then if I'm fishing any other wide body bait, this right here, the WRM 959 is 100% my favorite hook for any creature baits, flipping, pitching, Carolina rigging, things like that. This is a really good hook. All right, and then, you know, of course, you're gonna have a weight, and then here's a bead. We're gonna talk about that in a minute. I use the Fitzgerald tungsten worm weights. So varies as far as the size weight, depending on what you're doing. But as far as the line goes, I use anywhere from 10 to 20 pound test, either Seagar Tatsu. Okay, this is a really good all around line, just a, you know, ultra premium line. And then if I'm fishing more around rock or like shell beds or something like that, a BrazeX is a really good line as well. Again, 10 to 20 pound test, depending on what you're trying to accomplish and the water clarity, the cover density, things like that. That's kind of the range that I use for my Texas rigs. Now, the line or the rod that I use for pretty much all my worming techniques, you know, if I'm bottom bouncing, throwing a worm, you know, I'm going to be using a 7.3 medium heavy all-purpose series rod from Fitzgerald, and then I spool that on a 7.2 to 1 or 8.1 to 1 gear ratio reel. Okay, actually the 8.1 to 1, this is one of the situations where I like a burner bait casting reel, because you know you're not really overworking the bait if you have a high speed gear ratio, because you're more so working the bait with your rod and just picking up slack with the reel. So an 8.1 to 1 is actually a really good you know, speed. Now obviously depending on the brand, that speed is going to change a little bit, that gear ratio, but something in the 8 range is actually pretty darn good. All right, so now let's get started with the customizations that I like to do with a Texas rig. So the very first one, I kind of already let the cat out of the bag earlier, and that is to add a bead in between your weight and the worm or whatever bait that you're using. So as you can see here, you can probably hear it. It adds a nice little subtle clacking sound. So it's like almost like a rattle, but a little bit more subtle. And as long as that weight is free floating on the line, it really allows this bait to, you can shake it a little bit and create a little bit of that noise. Now this is actually something that I'm taking a cue from the old school West Coast guys. You know, if you guys haven't heard of Don Iovino, you need to look him up, because he was really the grandfather of this style of rig, you know, like the brass and glass. That's what he called his old style of like shaken rig, where he has a bead in between his weight and the bait. Now back then they were using brass because that was the more dense material that they had available to them. Nowadays tungsten is extremely dense and makes a really good rattling sound against that bead. Doing this, when I want to do this, is anytime I'm trying to draw fish out of cover. So a great example is if I'm going down to Florida, maybe fishing, you know, an offshore hydrilla or something like that. If I'm fishing the edges of that, a lot of times the fish are kind of dug into that grass. And so you need something to kind of draw them out. And that little bit of sound really makes a difference. Same thing with brush piles. You know, if I'm fishing brush piles and working a bait like the Mag Fatties through that brush pile, I want a little bit of sound to get those fish curious as to what that is and come a little bit closer. So I think this is a really good way, a subtle way to draw fish to the bait. And so I do it quite often. The one thing I will mention is it's really important to use a type of bead that is not going to chip or crack when you're using like tungsten or some other hard type of you know, weight. That's really important, because you don't want to use like glass. Like I know Don Iovino used to use glass, but glass is definitely going to chip and you could slice your line really super easy. So just keep that in mind. All right, so the next tip that I have for you guys, the customization, is using some sort of pegging system or bobber stop to peg your weight, to make it immobile, to kind of keep it in place. Now, there's two different trains of thought here. You know, if I'm using this bead that we just discussed, this clacking bead, if you will, I'm gonna need something that allows this weight to have a little bit of movement. So what I'll do is I'll use a bobber stop. Okay, I'll use a bobber stop, put it on the line. You know, we'll just pretend right up here. We'll just put it up here, get a little bit of distance between the weight and the bobber stop, just so it has, you know, some range of motion to be able to, you know, move and clack into that bead. And so that will be the way that I peg this bait. Now you can move the bobber stopper down and make it real tight so that weight's not going anywhere. But in that case, I probably just get rid of the bead, you know, and just have the weight right next to the bait, you know, because you're not really able to cause that sound if the weight doesn't have any range of motion. So bobber stops are good if you're still trying to use that bead and get a little bit of sound from that. But my favorite way to peg a weight, if I'm trying to keep it completely immobile, especially if I'm flipping, pitching, or punching, is with one of these suckers right here. This is a T-stop, okay? And a rubber T-stop is great because you just slide the pointy end through the back of the weight. And then what I do is I pull it till it's snug on the top. I'm not actually gonna do this, I don't think, just to waste a peg, but then you would trim this end, and then before you trim the other end here, you would pull this to make that cut end on the back flush with the hole. So you just pull it up and then cut the top, you know, off like that to make it flush. So both ends are flush. But this is a great way to make your bait, your weight, completely immobile, okay? And the reason why you'd want to peg a bait in general on a Texas rig is to keep the weight and the bait connected. So if you're fishing dense cover, especially vegetation or even brush piles, it's really important to make sure that weight is, you know, connected with that bait, because sometimes the weight, if it's just free floating, the weight will go through the cover, but the worm will be all the way up here, and that's just not something that you want to do. So pegging is very important for dense or thicker cover, you know, brush piles, you know, trees, vegetation, all different types of stuff that you want the bait to you know, follow the weight with. All right, so the next customization that I do is something that I really started doing recently, and I absolutely cannot believe I haven't been doing it sooner. Now, I've been using super glue for years, you know, for decades really. I've been using it to attach my soft plastic or Elastec baits to like jigs, chatterbaits, spinner baits, you know, any of those jig heads, okay? So I've been using it quite a bit. But last year, I was fishing along and I was flipping this edge of grass, and I was so frustrated with how my bait kept on sliding down the shank of the hook and kinking like this. I was like, gosh, man, I wish there was a good way to do it where, you know, the bait would be, you know, pretty much locked into the eye of the hook. And, you know, I was thinking about the toothpick trick that people do. A lot of people will do like some skirt material and bring it through. There's a lot of different tricks that people would do to do that. But then I was like, wait a minute, I've been using super glue all this time. All I need to do is put a little drop right there on the eye of the hook. So right there, just a tiny little drop, and then put my worm back in place, and voila, that thing is not going anywhere. That I could not believe when I started doing that I hadn't done it before, because it's so simple and it's so close to how I was already customizing with super glue with my jig heads and, you know, lead head style baits. So that is a great way if you're flipping or pitching or just in general, you know, fishing a Texas rig, and you're having a lot of frustration because the worm is sliding down the shank of the hook. Just put a little bit of super glue on the eye, tuck that hook back into the bait, and it's not going anywhere. I mean, like right here, I can tear it off, you know, to change baits, but in general, it's not really going anywhere. All right. So the next and final customization that I think is really, really cool is actually a brand new system that Z-Man came out with. It's called the Rattlesnaker. All right, so this little sucker right here really solves a problem that, you know, I'm kind of solving with that little bead that I put on my Texas rig. But this is another way to get a little bit of sound into your bait. So this right here, you get these little tiny rattles, okay? And then you've got this injector device here. And actually the rattles go into the back of the device here, the rattlesnaker. But essentially, we've got this hypodermic needle deal, all right? So we're gonna pull that back so the little shaft that goes into that hypodermic needle is pulled back. And all you do is you take it, and I'm gonna put it in the back of this tail here because I think this is a great place to add a rattle because I feel like the tail, when it's sticking up, especially with the Lastech, that's where the action's gonna be and the most shaking is gonna happen. So I feel like the most noise is gonna come from the tail. So we're just gonna stab that, don't stab yourself, and then we're going to push in that to inject the rattle into the tail. And there you go. That's the best way to inject a rattle into a Lastech especially, but it'll work with traditional plastics too. So now you've got that rattle in the back of the tail. It's very subtle. You know, you're talking about how subtle the little clacker is on this rig. This is even more subtle. You hear that? So it adds just a little bit of sound, and fish in general are very, very curious. So whenever they hear that sound, that little rattle like that, it definitely imitates a feeding bluegill or crawfish. You know, I think that this little rattle that has two little beads in it probably will imitate a crawfish better, like a crawfish that's eating, munching on something. A bluegill sounds a little bit more like this, you know, where it's like popping once and grabbing something off the bottom. Anyways, guys, those are some key customizations that you can do to your Texas rigs to make them more effective and efficient overall. And, you know, these are all things that I use on the water pretty regularly. And especially that little bead thing that creates that kind of Don Iovino brass and glass type presentation. That's one that I use a lot and I just started talking about. So give it a shot. I know it's gonna help you catch more fish. All of these different customizations are gonna help you catch more fish. Again, if you guys have any questions or want me to cover a topic, drop a comment below. Make sure you like, share, subscribe. Other than that, I'll see you out on the water. Trust the process.